Hello, my name's Andy Tidy and welcome to History Walks. Today finds us in Droitwich, and the very name of this place gives a clue to its origins. If you think about the other witches that you might know, there's Middlewich, Netherwich and Droitwich, the thing they all share in common is that this was a source of salt. In fact, the roots of Droitwich go back a very, very long way. Originally, this was a Roman settlement, and the Roman settlement was called Salinae. It also sounds very similar to saline, and in Roman-speaking Latin, it simply means the salt works. It's telling that in the Roman days, they actually paid the soldiers a measure of their wages in salt, hence your salary. But the Romans left, and salt production continued. It became known as Saltwich to the Anglo-Saxons. But then in 1215, when the town achieved its royal charter, it had the title Droit added to it, which means right. So there was a right to extract the salt from the brine measures. To give it its full title, Droitwich Spa, the spa element was added by John Corbett. He developed a spa resort here in the 19th century where people came to enjoy the brine and the health benefits that it brought. That's not the end of the significance of names. Right beside me here in Vines Park you find two waterways. To my right there is the Canal, and to my left there is the River Salwop. The River Salwop is a little stream, but what Salwop actually means is sal is salt and warp is to throw up. So it's the stream that throws up salt. And that's no exaggeration. You see, the salt that came out from the brine spring beneath this park was intensely salty. Every gallon of brine that was extracted contained 2.5 pounds of fine salt. And to put that into context, that's 10 times saltier than the sea, and it's even saltier than the Dead Sea in the Holy Land. Demand for the canals dwindled away in the 1920s, and by 1934 they were both formally abandoned. But that wasn't the end of the canals. After languishing in a state of disrepair for many decades, they were finally restored in 2011. And in the process of restoring both the barge canal and the junction canal, you ended up with this amazing park that runs right through the centre of Droitwich. A park which the locals love, and a park which has just recently achieved the green flag status. We'll take a look at some of the old buildings of Droitwich, and particularly those which relate to the salt works on which the place was founded. So let's go see what we can see. This is the last broad lock on the Droitwich Barge Canal. It's purely a flood lock. Most of the time the water stands level at both sides, but in times of flood the gates are needed, and the gates protect the waterway and the park from flooding. No story of Droitwich would be complete without mention of St. Richard of Droitwich. The story goes that in about 1250 the brine failed, so they called in St. Richard, or I guess he was just Richard at the time, the Bishop of Chester, and he came in and he blessed the pit, and amazingly the brine started to flow again. So ever since the guy has been canonised and become St. Richard, and he's a key figure here in Droitwich. As well as the brine spring which still flows into the River Salwop, there are two of the 3 brine pits still marked. This one, which is fairly humble, does still have brine seeping out. But more photogenically, this is the Upwell pit, believed to be the one that St. Richard actually blessed. Built on the site of the original pit, it's a reproduction of how it used to look in medieval days when brine was lifted to the surface using buckets. Even today, the feat achieved by St Richard is remembered, and once a year in the Maybank holiday, Droitwich hosts the St Richard's Festival, and this quiet park is taken over for one weekend by music, dance, stalls and all manner of entertainment. A walk just beyond Waitrose brings us to Gurney's Lane and one of the town's brine pumping sites. This was the loading entry for the coal. This fed the boilers that stood on the site and the beam engine that pumped away. And what we see at the far end is the bottom of the old chimney that was taken out due to instability. And we also see the remains of some of the pipework and ductwork that was used so that the brine, once extracted, was pumped away to the various salt works in the town. This was an expansion vessel so that when the pumping mechanism pumped, it's a bit like an accumulator. There was a balance of air in it and it equalised out the pressures. Now over time, millions of tonnes of salt was extracted. It was the third largest producer of salt in the UK. Now all this comes at a price, because what you take out leaves a void beneath. And when you walk around this part of Droitwich, you start to feel almost giddy because none of the buildings seem to stand up straight. The lamppost you see there is indeed vertical, but the adjoining houses absolutely are not. Now the building we see in the corner here, which is being restored, is actually a really important old building, not only in terms of Droitwich but also in terms of the country. This is number 31, High Street, Droitwich. It's a building that dates back to the 1400s. And rather than seeing it languish into disrepair, a huge amount of effort has been taken to effect a really sympathetic restoration. It's a bit of a case of triggers new broom, because as you can see, there are some old bits, but there's also an awful lot of new. Look at this. If you look at the carvings in the corbels, there are those flowers, and where there's a bit of a flower left, the bit that's remaining has been kept and a new bit carved underneath it. The trouble with all this brine extraction is that the immediate area under it sank. So you can see that the shop fronts have all been lined up so they're level, but the houses above them are all over the place. It's a good job that it's a terrace, because I think pretty much these houses all support each other. Now, tucked up Tower Hill, there is the last brine pumping station in Droitwich. This was built in the late 1800s, but not actually used until the 1920s. These days, brine is still extracted from this well, but it's extracted by an electric pump. Now, I think it's fair to say that Droitwich is never a very busy place, but here in its heart there is St Andrew's Church. This has been a place of worship for 700 years. And there are elements of this church that go right back to 1200, so really back into the medieval days. It looks a very short, squat thing these days, but it used to have a good tower on top, but that was reduced in the 1920s because, you guessed it, the subsidence in the area meant the whole place became unstable. And here you have the Droitwich Town Hall, built in 1825. when it was originally built, these posts at the side were freestanding and the inside section was an open market area. These days the centre of Droitwich has kind of migrated up the hill, but it's pretty clear to see that the town isn't exactly as prosperous as it was in its spa heyday. But what Droitwich does enjoy is a strong sense of civic pride, and you can never knock the town for not doing its bit for the community. All over the place there are fascinating statues, sculptures and echoes of the past. Now, we've mentioned John Corbett before. He was the man who put the spa into Droitwich Spa, and he built the Worcestershire Hotel. The hotel is now long gone, being replaced by quite an elegant block of flats. John Corbett was massive in the salt trade. He pumped up salt from the Brine spring 200 feet below. He had salt works here and at Stoke Prior. And building on the proceeds of his enterprise, he built the magnificent Chateau Impney just a few miles away. It was to this spot that people flocked in their thousands to take advantage of the medicinal qualities of the Droitwich brine. The brine was too saline to be taken as a drink, but people bathed in it, and immersion in the brine was believed to be a prevention and a cure for cholera. Today, after 2,500 years, salt production in Droitwich is virtually at a standstill. However, the brine is still extracted, and it's pumped here into the Droitwich Lido. The Lido's waters are a play place in the summer, and they are maintained at the same salinity as sea level. Curiously, Droitwich was never able to claim to be a thermal spa, because the water that came out, whilst it is warm, was not quite warm enough to be classed as thermal. You see, to be a thermal like bath, the water needs to be above blood temperature, and here it's just a little bit below. But nonetheless, for a period after the salt trade had finished, the brine was given a second lease of life. These days it's not exactly buoyant, but it does mean you can float just a little bit more easily here in the Droitwich Lido. And so we come to the end of this history walk here on Dada Hill. Dada Hill is the mound that overlooks Droitwich. And here behind me there is the blackened tower of St Augustine's on Dada Hill. And St Augustine's has suffered more than its fair share of trials over the years. But the blackened appearance you see today has nothing to do with the fire that destroyed its nave. This is the windward side of St Augustine's, and this is the side that faced into the smoke that was produced by all of those fires used to boil up the brine and to make the salt. So even though the salt industry is long gone and the last commercial venture to take salt out finished a good 100 years ago, the telltale blackened remains still stain the outside of this fine old church. Droitwich even played its part in the Civil War. The town was staunchly royalist, and the Roundhead soldiers were sent up here to Dada Hill, and they were billeted in the church. And the reason they wanted the high ground was exactly the same reasons as the Romans. It was an excellent place to defend. And more importantly, the Roundheads were able to get their cannons, point them over towards Droitwich and fire their cannonballs into the midst of the enemy. I guess that the Royalists had the last laugh though, because in 1646 King Charles's soldiers stormed up the hill, took the church and set fire to it. Anyway, that is a potted history of Droitwich. Covers a couple of miles and takes in the key sites. If you want to see more, pop into the Droitwich Spa Tourist and Heritage Centre. They've got a great salt museum and they've got some maps and some guides that will show you around this really lovely little town. So I hope you've enjoyed this history walk. Maybe it's inspired some of you to get your boots on and to go out and have a hunt for yourself. So, happy hunting, and I'll see you soon.